All right, so we're going to start a civil discussion. So during our book club, our Bearded Ladies book club sessions, we had 4 sessions total spanning over 4 weeks. Each week we would read a quarter of the book, discuss what happened, and then we would predict or figure out what's going to happen next. And then the following week we would either be amazed at how right we were or just shocked at how wrong we were and did not expect that twist. So some of the things I'd like to talk about is our first week, after reading the first quarter of the book, some of the things that we discuss is this idea of who the main character is and why they are that. Some of the questions are, why is Will the main character in this story? Which at the time, before we got to that, it seemed like Will was posed the main character. The perspective of writing was mostly from his point of view. It sometimes touched on other people's, but for the most part it stayed with Will. But it kind of seems like, and you guys can either agree or disagree, but it feels like by the end of the story, the kids are almost forgotten. Like, it's Charles Holloway who takes the spotlight, who does a lot of this stuff, and I might just be staying alone, but this is some of the predictions we made, at least some of the things we considered, is, do you guys feel like Charles ended up being the actual main protagonist in the story, just in his actions?
I would argue that he became the champion of the idea that Ray Bradbury wanted to come across, which is, I don't know if this is spoiler territory or not, but it's the idea that happiness and joyfulness can outweigh darkness and fear. Charles essentially became the embodiment of that. If you want to argue in traditional protagonist sense, we do see William's thoughts the majority of the time, and the majority of the novel takes place through Will's eyes. When we move over to Charles' perspective, we don't really see what's happening inside his head. We see more of an outsider's omnipresent point of view on him. So I would argue that Charles is the manifestation of the point that Ray was trying to make, but that Will is ultimately the protagonist because, Charles is Will's father, and Will is they ultimately end up, well, you know the rest.
Well, and I think also Will being the protagonist kind of gave it more room for him to grow, because he was so apprehensive at first, whereas Jim was more a go-getter and he wasn't scared of anything because of his past experiences. So I think that Bradbury probably did that on purpose.
Okay.
Also, we do see Charles's action is spurred by Will initially. So Will is the catalyst that causes Charles's interest and ultimate metamorphosis.
Well, and I think also in the beginning we definitely questioned what role Charles Holloway would play, because he was the older dad who didn't have any connect to his son really, and he was the librarian janitor, which him being in that setting definitely played a big role as well.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. Moving on, one of the things that we also talked about in our second meeting was after the carnival had been erected and we started seeing some of these characters. One of the notes that we made is that we believe that the carnival is sentient and that all the people are just an extension of his hive mind, his being Mr. Dark. In the end, we still kind of feel that this is something that persisted through, because we have Mr. Cougar, who seems to be doing stuff. For me, I felt as though it was more that they're willing to follow him, not so much of hive mind. They've learned to respect and fear Mr. Dark for who he is, for the fact that he's the one that's been kind of making these deals with people and them working in the carnival. It's more of fear and respect, not so much hive mind.
I would actually argue against that. I would say that Mr. Dark has transformed we're getting into spoilers, but Mr. Dark has transformed the patrons of the carnival into his quasi-minions, so to speak, and we get this when we hear the passage of the dwarf who was once the weather vane salesman where they seem to be acting out of instinct rather than a conscious respect and fear. It's more visceral than that.
Like they're acting out of their own desires, and he's more the powerhouse, I would say.
Yes.
All right, and so for our third meeting, the most exciting part about the book that has to do with Will, in all honesty, the Dust Witch. Great scene.
Ah, yes.
Lovely.
The Dust Witch.
It's just
Horrifying.
Horrifying scene. I feel like that was the height of where it gets from YA to adult in that aspect. For these scenes, for these kids, this is the real metamorphosis, as Perry puts it, for Will. Will has been a character that has mostly been willing to just, no pun intended, to just kind of avoid any circumstances that are inappropriate or dangerous. A lot of the times when it comes to the carnival, he wanted to be the one that would leave, and while Jim wanted to stay. But during this witch scene, he has this kind of courage that, to me, felt that it's coming out of nowhere. I don't know if it's like just a sudden realization, but this was like the best scene. But the one thing that I couldn't get past is that it seemed like Will all of a sudden became a lot braver than his character was kind of shown beforehand. Does this feel the same for you guys? Do you feel that Will suddenly finds courage, or that just that he's in a situation that he knows he has to follow through with for protecting others, protecting himself, or is it just now he's a courageous character?
Well, the slime was on Jim's house.
No, it was on Jim's house?
It was on top of Jim's house.
Because he didn't have the
he didn't have the weather vane. And so I think that this kind of goes back into the theme of friendship, and where they kind of act as a dynamic duo. And when someone cannot act in a courageous manner, the other one kind of shows that courage, and him taking the slime off and fighting against the Dust Witch kind of shows, like, when you are put into these situations,
Fight or flight response.
Exactly.
But it's, to me, it's more extensive than that. He doesn't just chase it down. You know, he comes prepared, and he puts himself in incredible peril to go on this. And I know I might be wrong about this. Just in my reading of it, I felt that a little bit of his courage was unmerited, but for the aspect of where it goes into YA, that is a theme where characters will suddenly gain an attribute that they once didn't have for the premise of plot. What about you, Perry?
So during this conversation, I was mainly looking up, I wanted to talk specifically about the Dust Witch. Her imagery reminded me very specifically of Baba Yaga, in that she was this, like, witch that would fly. She's in Russian folklore, and she flies around in a mortar and pestle. So we have that kind of, like, this malformed woman flying around in something that seems off and strange. In terms of Will's bravery, I think in a way it was building up to this moment, because we have him show his bravery in smaller ways, in telling his father, in keeping Jim away from the carnival. And I think, going off of what Cass was saying, this sort of fight or flight response, I think, is very critical in this. And I think a lot of it comes from desperation and the need to protect his family and his best friend, which goes back to the themes of family in the novel as well.
Well, I'm afraid I don't want to get into spoiler territory for the ending, so some of the last question that I would want to ask about this is the carousel, the device that's able to go forwards and backwards, changing your age either way, is it the embodiment of evil? Is the carousel itself evil, or the people who operate it evil?
I would say that, like Charles, the carousel is a manifestation of the forces of evil that Ray Bradbury was trying to illustrate in his novel. I would say that the carousel, since it does not have a specific mind of its own, because it does have to be activated, it can be broken, it can be used for good or for evil. But I would say that the influences that it has on humans or on man's desires, to put it in a formal way, but I would say it acts as more of an influence onto, because, you know, we talked about, like, is Mr. Dark really the antagonist of Something Wicked This Way Comes, or is he just another victim of the carousel? And I think that's a very interesting question to explore. I still haven't come to a specific yes or no on that. I think there are arguments to be made for either one, so I'm interested as to what you guys think on that subject.
Well, for me, I just felt like the carousel was a tool. It's always a tool, but in the sense that it's evil in the sense of how nature's evil. It's not evil inherently, it's how we perceive it. You know, a hurricane or a tornado doesn't have any evil intentions. Yes, it's destructive, it's formidable, and it's kind of scary to experience, but it's not evil. And that's what I kind of felt with the carousel. But seeing
You said that the carnival is evil in the way that nature is evil, but yet in multiple times during the novel they make allusions to the fact that growing up too quickly or speeding or de-aging too quickly creates a disconnect, because your mind is young but your body is old, and vice versa. So there's something unnatural about what the carnival produces.
It's unnatural what it produces, but in itself it's not evil. That's what I'm saying, because as you were saying before, someone has to operate it. Someone has to adjust it either to go forwards or backwards. Someone has to be willing to go on it. The carousel itself doesn't actually do anything on its own. It has the ability to bring someone forward or backwards in their timeline, age-wise, and that's what it does. And I don't think it's evil, but I think it creates evil, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I think it definitely represents desire and that luring effect that our desires have. But it's not necessarily evil in itself. I think it just provokes people to act upon those desires.
All right, well, I really enjoyed this conversation. Thank you so much for being on the podcast, Perry Fenton and Cassidy Fix.